Hello, as he said, my name's Corey Latislaw. I'm here to talk to you about, well, basically my passion for Android. So I've done a lot of different technologies and a lot of different stacks, and eventually I found Android after being an iOS developer for a short time. And I was really excited about the possibilities and being able to affect billions of people's lives, because it's really the world phone. And I'm not going to be giving the world phone talk today, but if you've seen that before, there's some similar themes throughout here. But I've been giving that talk for the last year, and the one thing that I didn't feel like I really expressed all that well is that the challenges I was talking about in emerging markets actually applied to everybody, and we should be thinking about that no matter who we're trying to serve with our applications. And as Michael mentioned, I'm working at Off Grid Electric now, and it is basically my passion is my day job, which is pretty awesome. We install solar in rural villages in Africa. So this one lady on the left, like that, we put a solar system in her house. And these are very off-the-grid places in the middle of nowhere. I'll tell you a little story later about like one adventure we had. But yeah, so it's like we are enabling people to create their own businesses, like barbershops or charging stations, or students to be able to read at night instead of breathing in kerosene. So let's talk about why you should care about some of this stuff. So basically, within the last decade, apps and devices have been completely indispensable in our modern lives. There's an app for everything. We use it every day. If we forget our phones, we really kind of freak out and feel, like, oh, wait, was there a notification there? So I don't know. Like, when my phone dies halfway through the day, I feel a little lost for the rest of the day. And Android is in 190 countries right now, so it's pretty ubiquitous in the world, which is pretty amazing. There's 1 million new Android devices activated every single day. That's every day. And 85% of the global market share is Android. 85%. So there's only 15% of essentially iOS. Well, I guess 14 and then 1% of all the other stuff. And there's 2 billion Android devices right now, but there's 7 billion people. So there's about 5 billion people who don't really have devices. Well, they don't have Android devices anyway. And we're not going to talk too deeply about emerging markets today, but this is a place where it's going to continue to grow. And we'll talk about some of the design, technical, and testing challenges associated with that. But basically, it's going to be an amazing opportunity, and a lot of the devices aren't that great, or are going to be working offline a lot, so you need to think about these sort of things ahead of time. One of the biggest areas for growth right now are like Brazil and Russia, India and China, and there's a lot of people there. So, and one of the major factors behind this is it's a lot cheaper than an iOS device, which is about $700, but Android on average is $275. We're trending toward $30 on the low end. So that's much more affordable. And 65 billion apps were downloaded just last year. And then we get another 1.5 billion every month, people getting new apps and games. So what's really amazing about that, though, is within the last decade, it's not even 10 years that you can download apps from a shared marketplace for whatever system you're using. It used to be you had to write an application for an OEM with their specific SDKs, and you couldn't really port that to other devices. So you had to write it like 5 times or whatever, depending on how many places you were targeting. So that was really limited. So when Apple and then Android created these marketplaces, this really opened up for independent developers, like probably a lot of you in this room, to create applications that can reach, in Android's case, billions of users. And it's going to be worth $102 billion by 2020, the global market for buying applications. In 2012, it was $53 billion, so it's already doubling in just like an 8-year time period, which is an amazing possibility. It's huge. We haven't even really begun to tap what that means yet. And this simply wasn't possible before those platforms existed. So one of the themes and feedback I got on the Android is the World Phone talk is it's like, oh, well, that's great if I was going to do developing markets. But you don't have to choose between those two. There's a lot of overlap in the challenges that people experience. The thing is, in the developing world, instead of it just being a minor annoyance that your battery dies midday and then you just charge it with a charging pack, you might have to go pay somebody to bike your phone somewhere else to be able to use your device again. So they're the same challenges, but they affect us disproportionately. So And really, you still run into it in the developed world too. So I got rate limited when I went to Berlin for my Android talk because I started using Snapchat. I'm not entirely sure what it does with all that data, but basically it killed my phone and wasted all my data, and I was using 2G for the rest of the week I was there. But really, the basic point here is that more people have access to our apps than ever before. We have an opportunity to impact people's lives on a deep level, and billions of people's lives. I mean, that's just, I don't know, that is what really excites me about Android, being able to connect with people on that level. Because if you think about the applications you use on a daily basis, they really do shape the, the color of your life, which is awesome. And Android, like we mentioned, is cheap enough that everyone has access to it. So it really is the world's phone. So today, I'm going to talk about the general challenges, which really align with the tracks today that Michael laid out. And I also encourage you to kind of pop around and do the different things, but we're going to talk about design challenges that you should think about, and then how to develop your applications, as well as some of the things you can do with testing, and then finally just a framework for how to think about your apps. So design plays an integral role, as you know, in basically every application. If it's an awful design, nobody's going to use your app. And a well-designed app can really bring people together. But one thing you need to start thinking about is that once you start opening up to the entire world, which Android is designed by its nature to do, there are a wide diversity of different design challenges you need to address there. It's as diverse as the world that it's based on. So, one thing I totally forgot to mention. I don't know if you're familiar with this term sketchnoting, but if you draw and take you write and draw notes from this, and then you tweet at me, I will retweet you. I love sketchnoting, and I'd love to see if anybody here creates some. I know at least 2 people I talked to yesterday were considering it. So, oh good, get your paper out. But yeah, so if you sketchnote, I'll retweet you, and my name is my Twitter handle. But back to the talk. So one of the main things we need to do is develop empathy. And that's really hard because if you think about your own experience, you just kind of tend to assume that that's going to apply to everybody. That's not true at all. People have very slow phones. They have really bad data plans. They have expensive data plans. That's not what we have. We have ubiquitous access to data plans. They're fairly cheap. We have Wi-Fi. We have plugs everywhere. You can find plugs all around here, for example. And really, we are a highly educated bunch. We have a strong global network. That's not true of the average citizen of this world. And besides that, not everybody has the same technical background that we do. So I lived through the whole home computers through smartphone in my hand evolution. I had a pager. I had a PDA. I had all these different things. And as a new device came out and merged 2 or 3 things together, I would discard the old devices and just move along with this evolution. This is what most of us in here has probably seen. This is not true of the developing world. They haven't seen this incremental change, which would speed adoption to new things that would make more sense to them. What we take for granted is a learned skill. We still learn how to use those devices, but we just already have a base that makes it really easy. For billions of people, their first computer is going to be a mobile phone or a tablet, and their first access to the internet is going to be over cellular networks. That's very different than how we have interacted with technology historically. As such, we need to think about offline first designing. So basically, at Off-Grid, part of the reason why I joined their team, they have an application right now. So you go out into the field as a service agent, and you go install a solar system, or you fix it, or whatever, and then you say, I'm done with this task, and it sends information back up to the server. They have so many interaction points that require talking to the server. For example, like, does this phone number already exist in the database? I'm done with this task, a bunch of different interaction points. But if you make it so that you can queue those and they can just continue to work offline, that's a better experience for them. So that's one of those things you need to think about. What are the places where we're forcing synchronization with the server when we don't have to do that? How can you eliminate those and redesign some of the flows? And also, you want to make sure that the app still feels like it's doing something, even if you're offline, even if it's slow. Give them some sort of animation or something. Perceived performance is really important here, as well as notifying them of the state that they're in. So, for example, with the tasks, I'm done with a task, it'll have a little thing that says, this needs to be synced later, sort of notification. So you know that you have it submitted, but it hasn't gone all the way through the server. But you don't feel like, oh no, I don't know if this is actually gonna eventually happen. So just make sure people feel comfortable. And I'm sure you'll hear a bit about human-centered design and stuff while you're in the design track today. But basically, the idea is exploring users' needs and trying to triangulate onto the best user experience. Now, it might not be able to translate to everybody. You might need to tune experiences for different regions or whatever. It just really depends on what your use case is. And one of the major ways that you do this is creating prototypes and then observing people using your applications, see where they struggle, and figure out what you can do to make it better for them. Because there's not really a one-size-fits-all fix here, but you really need to get that feedback from people. Now, you can't be a jerk. There's a lot of, I see this a lot in developer communities. I'm sure it's true in most communities, but like people are like, this person's an idiot. Why don't they understand my design or my implementation or whatever? Why didn't they just do it the right way? If you have that sort of mentality, you're gonna have a really hard time with connecting with people. You need to drop that. They're not an idiot. You might be because, well, they didn't immediately intuitively understand what you were trying to do. And is that your fault or theirs? I think it's yours. It's probably yours. You really want to make a universally acceptable application that's going to work for just about everyone. Cool, so now we've got a prototype, we're getting feedback. What are you going to do with that feedback? Well, first of all, you have to make sure that it's actually valid. So for example, at Off-Grid, they had this paper flipping presentation, essentially. So they would go out and show this presentation. This is how much money you can save and stuff like that. So we decided, oh, they find that really useful. Let's make a digital version of that. So we did. And then we had people go out playing with our prototype in the field, and everybody diligently used it. Turns out, though, that it was because they were being watched, not because they actually found it useful. When people stopped watching them, they didn't use it because they would just talk to people that they're meeting on the street, and that would be more effective than this digital selling tool. So we spent a bunch of time developing that when we didn't really need to. So make sure that you are not changing the results of your design experiments in this way. So part of the problem you're going to face is that it's hard to get that feedback because there's geological challenges. You know, people are far away if you're trying to do it in rural Africa, for example. You can't just stuff them into a room and ask them a bunch of questions about your design. So one of the ways you can overcome this is by travel. This is my favorite way of doing it. I love travel. I don't know if you follow me at all, but I travel a lot. And there's really no substitute for direct experience. It really helps open your eyes to daily frustrations that your users are going to face. I already mentioned my time in Berlin, but like I had a similar thing when I went to Mexico. I bought a tiny little in-country phone, a little data plan, open Instagram, all the data's gone. It's like, that's not a great user experience. And Facebook and Instagram in 2014 sent engineers into the field to figure out what those pain points are and figure out how they can make it better. And a year later, they shipped a thing called Facebook Lite. It is 1 megabyte download. It works on 2G networks, and it uses far less data than regular Facebook does. So just by sending people into the field, they realized what was happening, and they made it so that they can continue to get billions more users. Now, if you can't really travel, doing things like hiring contractors in countries or maybe connecting with GDGs, which is a global network, would be really helpful for you there. So here's story time for me. So I went to Arusha last year, which is in Tanzania, and I spent a full month there figuring out what was going on with the app and its natural habitat. So one of the days I go out on a service run. So we have, I think it was like an hour drive to the beginning of trying to find house one. House one wasn't that bad. You just drove on kind of like back roads for a bit, and then you arrived. We just checked their system, everything was happy, and we moved on. Now the second one, it took us another like 2 or 3 hours to get to, and it was on the same road, but there were all these washed out gullies and stuff because it was a rainy season when we were there. So we would go one way, and then the road would be washed out, and then we would get help from picky-pickies or motorcycle riders or people who were standing around like on their farms and stuff. They would try and help us. So eventually we found this house. We had general GPS coordinates, but there aren't really addresses in Tanzania, so there's no give me turn-by-turn directions to get there. You just have to keep waypointing and hope that you get there. And I don't know if you've ever done that while hiking, doing like geocaching or something, but you can't always just go in a straight line to the place that you think you need to go. There's, a gully, for example. But yeah, so we finally got there. We did the task. It wasn't that hard to do it. And like I mentioned before, our internet doesn't work that well out there, so we couldn't actually finish the call in the application. They had to call the call center and say, hey, I'm done with this, and the call center then set it as complete. So then we go home. Well, we try to go home. Turns out there's a humongous storm, and it's like this red, crazy cloud that's far off in the distance, and then it just starts raining and pouring. And we're in like this van that's not four-wheel drive, and this guy is just driving. I thought he was like playing around, because basically we were doing this sort of thing, like back and forth. And I thought he was just being a jerk, but it turns out like we kept getting stuck, and people would get out, they push the truck, then it would like do the same thing again. And yeah, one time I fell. Like, it was really intense, and we were there stuck in the mud for, I don't know, 5 hours off and on. Eventually, Maasai, which are farmers, they had a tractor, and they pulled us out and pulled us over a tree, and then pulled us all the way to the gravel area. And then finally we could get to the main road, and then we could go home. So I left at 8 a.m. that morning. I didn't get back until 9 p.m., and that was 2 tasks, just to service 2 different customers. Now, for me, that was like a crazy exceptional day. For them, that's every day. Like, they get lost like this a lot. So there's a lot of logistical challenges that you're going to have to deal with in some of these environments. Now that we're done with the design talk, let's talk a little bit about development. So you probably have a fast phone that you're developing against, probably has good internet. You just end up assuming the best conditions because that's what you have. But you have to really be able to step back and think more about what other people are experiencing, because it's probably the opposite of what you're experiencing. They usually have slow, cheap phones that are outdated. Maybe they're old models that they bought second or third hand. They have small screens. They don't have a lot of memory. They're really slow. They're not that fun to use. Even the one it's got like Lollipop or something on it, but it's still slow. I don't know, my work phone is too slow. Like, I can't use it as my day-to-day phone, but that is other people's day-to-day. Now, maybe Android 1 will one day fix all of our problems, and that there'll be cheap phones with good specs that has the latest Android, but I'm not going to hold my breath. There's mixed reviews on the program, but hopefully, one day this will kind of not be an issue anymore. So some of the things you can do to be better with the device is make sure that you look for profile memory usage and find places where you can write the application in a faster way, or at least make it look faster with that perceived performance thing I mentioned before. You can also speed up your application starts and manage your images better, because not only are you downloading the images, but then you have to render them too. So those are 2 interesting areas as far as memory management goes. And really make sure that you are using the different densities and device configurations to the most of your ability. Make sure that you actually are doing things all the way down to small devices. Like, one of the things our agents use in the field is a Samsung Pocket. It's this tiny little phone. And they're still able to use it to do the tasks. And a lot of your apps probably would be able to work there as well. So Google recommends that we only do about 10 megabytes for a download of an APK. Otherwise, people might not install it. It's just too big. It's too expensive for this. At OGE, we keep it around 2 megabytes. Usually, we have a new application with all the rich media that I mentioned. That one's not 2 megabytes. So now we have to figure out a strategy to make sure that they don't have to download it all the time. Because if we just change the code and not the images and stuff, do we want them to download the 50 megabytes again? Probably not. So you can do things like doing multiple APKs, splitting out your multimedia into different download packs, stuff like that to help you do this a little bit better. Also make sure that you check your dependencies and figure out which ones are the most useful for your application. Is it a memory hog? Is it a performance hog? Is it wasting all of your data? Is it really well tested? Do you even know what it's doing for you? A lot of times we'll just pull a lot of third-party libraries in without really doing due diligence to figure out if it's going to actually help us. But on the other side of that, You don't want to rewrite it from scratch and then bear that maintenance burden if it's a widely respected library out there that has really good unit test coverage and a really strong open source community. So you just have to weigh those two different benefits and risks and figure out what's best. So I've mentioned this a little bit, but we really have access to a lot of data that most people don't. And besides having cheap data, so really in the world, network communications is pretty spotty. I even see this on travel. Even just driving to Michigan and Ohio, I lost internet a lot when I was trying to listen to Google Music on my fancy new radio. So like we don't always have that data access here. So it's spotty, and it's even spottier in other places. And then one really interesting thing that I found, that I heard in the Building for Billions talk from Google is that about 10% of someone's income is used to pay for data. So if you think about what 10% of your income is, for me, that's half my rent and 23 times what I pay for data currently. So they are paying a lot of money for data that you're not paying. So it's another thing where it's that differential really doesn't enter your mind typically, but it should, because that data isn't always as useful as you think it is. So back to the network, dealing with networks. So what you really want to make sure that the information that you're downloading is useful. So I don't know if you use Snapchat, but I do a little bit. And I went to Berlin, and it was downloading everybody's stories, even when I was in travel mode. Like, I really don't care about everybody else's stories. I want to share what I'm doing in my thing. And if I go back to the hotel, then sure, I'll see everybody else's stuff. But when I'm out and about, don't show me that stuff. Allowing people to tune what they care about is really useful. Also, like Facebook videos, I don't need you to download that and show it to me, especially when I'm in Mexico. It doesn't matter at all to me. Please stop. So some of the things you can do is just make sure that you're using like a job management queue, which will then put things in the queue for batching network requests later, so you're not constantly waking up the radio, things like that. You can also figure out what data changes quickly and what data changes slowly. I call that data lanes, and then kind of figure out, can you do something like a push notification instead of polling constantly for updates? So just also looking at your architecture, not just your application, but how it interacts with the server can be really useful there. Also make sure you're actually caching things. Like, don't just download it, throw it away, re-download it. That happens a lot, and it's a really easy fix that's going to help your users pretty quickly. And also there are things like you can reduce your file sizes, use WebP images instead of JPEGs, stuff like that. And anything that you can bundle in the APK, do that. Balance that, of course, with the APK size, but that's an option for you as well. So I've mentioned my battery woes, but my phone right now is broken, so I had to go back to my Nexus 5, which is a nightmare. This phone died at 1 p.m. yesterday. Like, what is it doing? I don't understand. So like, this is an annoyance for me, but I have battery packs. There was a plug on the train. What if you were not living in an electrified village, though, and you didn't have solar in your home? You might have to walk to go charge your phone. Then you have to wait and then walk back. Or you might pay someone with a bicycle to bike it and then bring it back to you charged. And again, minor inconvenience for us, huge pain for them. So some of the ways that you can be better about battery is using docking state, figuring out what people are doing with your, if they're plugged into a wall and they're using Wi-Fi, why not download some of the data that they might need throughout the next day? That could be useful to them. But you don't necessarily need that while you're out and about. Also make sure that you're not looking up the internet constantly. Like I said earlier, using those batching network things is really helpful. And do you really need that heartbeat that constantly checks in with the server? Think about those sorts of things as well. Finally, profile your GPS usage and make sure that what you're doing with location tracking actually makes sense and benefits your user, not just necessarily your business. Cool. So now we've made an app. We've designed an app. It works well offline. We've written it. Now let's make sure it actually does the things we think it's going to do. Now, testing is not just a job for QA. So often that's how we view it. We're like, all right, I'll just throw this over the wall. When I'm done, QA will figure it out. But that's, we should be thinking about testing at every stage of the process. Designers should be validating the design as it's with users, and then also as it's being implemented. They might even be able to diagnose and help fix some of those issues. Developers should be thinking about testing at every stage. They should be writing unit tests, preferably TDD, which I'm a fan of. But being able to validate that you're doing the things that are expected of the application is really helpful. And then we can also do things like working with product owners and designers and QA and everybody to come up with an automated suite of tests. Now, you probably don't need it for every single area of your application, but you probably should do it for the most important and critical business flows. And finally, make sure that you're dog fooding your application. Everybody should be using the app and trying to find some of the issues that are happening. So the ideal here, which is hard to get to, I know I've been in a lot of orgs, we always talk about it, no one ever quite gets there, but getting to continuous testing and having a broad set of tests behind that is really helpful, especially if you can write those tests before developers even start developing the thing. And then you run the tests as you're going through to make sure that you meet those requirements. Like I mentioned, developers can write unit tests or do test-driven development while they're working on that. It's also useful to be able to automate alpha and beta builds, and there's a lot of tooling out there. Some of it will be talked about today in the testing track, so I encourage you to check that out. And then at I/O, they talked about test recording, where you can click through your application and might be able to create some of those flows for you with Espresso. So it's going to be important that you have a wide set of devices. Some people are very specific in the devices they support. We have 2 at our company. We don't support anything else because we buy our own devices and give them to our people. But if you have an app that is available to the wide world, then you're going to have to think about what it looks like on these other devices. So creating either a physical or a digital lab can be really helpful in that. Also make sure that you are testing that the network works as expected. The easy one is just to turn on airplane mode and then see how the app works and then turn it back off and see what happens whenever it's done. But there's also other tooling out there like Network Monitor and stuff, which you can use in Android Studio, that as long as you've got the tooling installed, you should be able to profile a lot of these things and file a lot of bugs against the developers. Same thing with battery. There are some profiling tools for that as well, like Battery Historian. And then also make sure that you've thought through what DOS is going to do to your apps, because it puts everything in a deep sleep. And then when it wakes up, question mark whether or not it works. Just make sure it works. And then finally, it's really useful to be able to report that out to everyone. Send out a notification when everything is broken, or does the regression suite fail? Keeping stakeholders involved and notified is really important. So now that we've explored the testing and design and developing things, let's now talk about how you can think globally whenever you're creating your applications. So Android is built on the principle of openness, and that's really something that we as developers should think too, be able to use, change, adapt the system to our needs. We should make those applications accessible to the world over, basically. The first one here is citizenship. So you're part of the world's diversity, and you can bring your global talents to the stage. You should really affect the world for the better. You do have that ability. And make sure that you're serving the needs of all your users, not just the privileged few like us in the United States, for example. Think globally when you're creating your apps, but work within your local variable scope to make sure that you can affect your organization and make this app better for everyone. Also, you're not better than your users. I know sometimes it feels like you are, but you're not. So just because you have more privileges doesn't mean that you should act that way. Don't look down on your users. Help bring them along instead of basically telling them that they're an idiot. If you just think they're going to figure it out, you're smart, they're dumb, you're not really going to make that application that's going to work the world over. Question your assumptions and step outside your comfort bounds so you can connect with others. So, to develop some empathy, just first of all, realize your experiences don't mirror the world. That's the first step. Don't just build something for here and hope it'll work somewhere else. So luckily, this is a learned skill, though. So I don't know if you've read the blog by Chad Fowler, but he talks about how you can build empathy as part of your daily practice. So first one is just listening to people when they talk. I'm not super great at this, but listen intently instead of looking for your opportunity to speak. And then put your phone down, talk to the person next to you or the person on the subway, and actually talk to different types of people. And then finally, if you're in some sort of conflict, just kind of think of yourself as a third-party observer to try and see both of the sides. So that'll help you see what other people are going through. Basically, just get closer to your user's experience. And for me, that's travel. Travel has really been absolutely transformative in my life. But even just taking interest in the world around you is really important. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but efficiency should be your primary operating principle. It's one of those things that if you write a fast app, it's probably going to be pretty easy to be able to make that app work everywhere else. You can't really just bolt it on later. It's a lot harder to do that. So I can hear you thinking, oh, I'd never be able to convince my PO that I have to do this sort of like, I want to do this profiling and doing that and that. Just do it yourself and then tell them later why. That's called leadership. You don't necessarily need buy-in from people. If you believe in something and if you think it'll help your users, do it and then help them. Sorry, Michael. Insurrection. Have the courage to stand up for your users, basically. So we've covered 4 principles for how you can think about your applications and make something for global market, including emerging markets. First, be a better global citizen and realize that you're part of this world. Have humility and realize that you're not better than your users. Have empathy for what your users experience. And finally, make your app as efficient as possible. Cool, so there's my Twitter handle again. But basically, when you truly value the user experience, you can bring more people on board. You can impact billions of people's lives. Billions of people's lives. Like, that still boggles my mind to this day, but that's what keeps me going. Your reach is greater than you imagine, and you can help bring people along. You can't know ahead of time how you're affecting people, but you can affect people one app and one experience at a time. Thank you.